What would you do if you were finally free after 30 years, but you refused to leave? That is the true story of Amos Carter, a 72-year-old inmate. His prison is closing, and he's finally a free man. But he tells the warden he won't go, saying he's staying for what's buried inside the walls. If you believe in the power of forgiveness and second chances, please like this video and subscribe so these stories of redemption can be heard. Stay with us, because what's hidden in his mysterious wooden box and the young officer who helps him will redefine the meaning of freedom. Northfield Prison was shutting down after 80 years. Reporters called it the end of an era. But for one old man sitting quietly in cell 209, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a promise, one he hadn't yet kept. Amos Carter, 72 years old, was the oldest inmate still left behind. While the others packed their things to transfer, he sat on his bunk with a small wooden box in his hands. His fingers, rough from years of labor, traced the carved words on its lid. Freedom begins within. No one knew what he kept inside that box. Some said it was a Bible, others a letter. But those who'd been around him long enough whispered it was a memory, the kind that hurts and heals at the same time. That morning, the warden himself came to his cell. "Carter," he said, his voice flat, "you're a free man next week. You can walk out of here." The old man looked up slowly. "Not yet, sir. My time ends when this place ends." The warden frowned. "You've done 30 years. Don't tell me you want to stay in prison." Amos smiled faintly. "It's not the walls I'm staying for. It's what's buried inside them." He didn't explain further. He just placed the box back under his pillow and turned toward the narrow window, where the morning light broke through the bars like a thin line of grace. Years earlier, before the gray walls and iron doors, Amos had been just another man trying to make a living in Jackson, Mississippi. He drove a truck, built furniture, fixed fences for neighbors. He wasn't rich, but he was loved. He had a wife, Evelyn, who sang in the church choir, and a daughter, Lane, who used to dance barefoot in the summer dust. They lived in a small yellow house with a cross above the front door. Sundays meant fried chicken, gospel on the radio, and peace. Then came the night that changed everything. A desperate favor, a wrong crowd, a gun that wasn't supposed to go off. Nobody died that night, but someone was hurt, and Amos took the blame. He told the judge it was his doing, not the young man who had a baby on the way. "Let me take it," he said. "He's got a future. I already had mine." The courtroom went silent. His wife cried, his daughter called his name. The bars closed, and the world went dark. Inside prison, the years folded over him like waves. He learned to pray again, not for release, but for peace. He became the man other inmates came to when they wanted to learn how to read or when they couldn't sleep from the weight of guilt. He fixed broken chairs, polished old wood, and found in every crack of the timber a kind of forgiveness. He'd say, "If you treat the wood gentle, it'll remember your touch." People are no different. 30 years. 30 Christmases behind walls that forgot his name. Evelyn passed while he was still inside. Lane stopped writing after the first year. Still, every night, Amos whispered the same prayer, quiet, trembling, honest. "Lord, if I can't go home, let my soul go home to you." Now, as the sun rose over Northfield for the last time, the old man looked at the tiny wooden box in his hands. Inside were 3 things: a faded photo of his wife and daughter, a folded note with a single sentence, and a small cross carved from scrap wood. He smiled softly to himself and said, "Maybe freedom ain't a gate you walk through. Maybe it's the place where you finally forgive yourself." The camera, or maybe the listener's heart, would linger on that box, that trembling hand, and that fragile smile. Because this wasn't a story about crime. It was a true story about forgiveness, redemption, and the second chance God sometimes hides inside the darkest places. The day Ella Martinez walked into Northfield Prison, she thought she knew what strength meant. She'd studied criminal justice, watched every documentary about law and order, and promised herself she'd be the kind of officer who could balance both discipline and heart. But nothing, not the books, not the training, prepared her for the sound of those gates closing behind her. She was 24, full of ideals, full of fear. Most guards looked past the inmates like they were shadows. But Ella, she noticed things. The way the men flinched when the intercom cracked. The way silence could feel heavier than chains. And the way one old man in cell 209 greeted her every morning with a nod, a smile, and the calm of someone who had made peace with the world. "Morning, sir," she said on her first day, her voice too polite for a place like this. He looked up from his workbench. "Morning, young lady. You must be new. You still smile." The words caught her off guard, and she laughed softly. "What are you making?" she asked. "A promise," he said. Then, after a pause, or maybe a memory, it was a small wooden box, the kind you'd find in a grandmother's attic, hand-carved, smooth at the corners, polished with patience. He worked on it every day, shaping it with sandpaper, humming softly under his breath. When she leaned closer, she saw he'd carved 3 letters on the lid, E and L. "Who are they?" she asked one afternoon. "My wife and daughter," he said, still carving. "They're the reason I wake up." There was no bitterness in his tone, no self-pity. Just a quiet kind of love, the kind that survives everything, even walls. That night, back in the break room, Ella asked another officer about him. "Carter," the man said. "Been here longer than the paint on these walls. Armed robbery back in '89. He could have walked out 3 years ago, but he refused the transfer." "Refused?" she asked. "Why?" "Something about a box," he shrugged. "Old folks and their ghosts." But to Ella, it didn't sound like ghosts. It sounded like unfinished business. She'd seen too many inmates who wanted money, or revenge, or just attention. This man wanted peace. The next morning, she found him sitting quietly in the chapel corner, sunlight spilling over his shoulders. She hesitated, then sat beside him. "You really could have left, you know." He smiled faintly. "Maybe. But freedom ain't about walking out. It's about what you leave behind." She wanted to ask more, but the chapel bell rang, ending visiting hour. Before she left, he said softly, "You remind me of my lane. Same eyes, same fire." Something about the way he said it made her stop in the doorway. She didn't know this man, but in that moment, she felt the weight of all the stories that never get told, the kind that live and die behind bars. That evening, alone in her small apartment, Ella couldn't shake his words. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Freedom isn't just leaving, it's forgiving." It was the first time she'd ever written something that wasn't part of a report. And though she didn't know it yet, that line, that small, whispered truth, would become the heartbeat of everything that came next. Because in Northfield Prison, mercy had found its way in, disguised as a young woman with kind eyes and a trembling heart. And soon she'd have to choose, follow the rules, or follow what was right. For weeks, Ella watched Amos Carter the way you watch the last ember of a dying fire. Quiet, patient, hoping it might still glow again. Every morning, He sat in the corner of the prison workshop, smoothing the same piece of wood, whispering words she couldn't hear. Most inmates complained about time. Amos seemed to listen to it. One afternoon, while the others argued over card games and cigarettes, he motioned for her to sit. "Do you believe people can change, Miss Martinez?" She hesitated. "I think people can try." He nodded as if that was enough. Trying's what keeps us human. He lifted the lid of the wooden box and showed her what was inside. An old photograph of a woman and a little girl, both smiling wide under a bright summer sky. "My Evelyn," he said softly, "and Arlene. She was 8 when that picture was taken." "They look happy," Ella said. "They were," he whispered, "before I broke everything that made them safe." He told her about the night that ruined their lives, a robbery gone wrong, a promise gone right. He'd taken the blame for another man, a friend from the old neighborhood who had a pregnant wife. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said. "Maybe I was. But doing good don't always mean doing right." Ella listened without interrupting. It wasn't the kind of story they trained her to hear. There was no self-justification, no drama, just regret, worn smooth like the surface of the box. "What happened to your family?" she asked quietly. His eyes went far away. "Evelyn passed 10 years ago. Lane stopped writing long before that." He paused, hands trembling slightly. "I keep this box for them. So if the Lord calls me before I walk free, they'll know I didn't waste the years. I learned how to love right, even from a cell." The silence between them felt sacred. For the first time, Ella understood. The box wasn't a secret. It was an apology carved in wood. That night, in her small room above the staff quarters, she couldn't sleep. She thought about her own family, her mother who still worked 2 jobs back in San Antonio, her uncle who'd been arrested for something he didn't do. She remembered how angry she'd been at the world then, how powerless. Now, sitting in the dim light, she realized Amos wasn't chasing freedom. He was chasing forgiveness. From his daughter, from God, from himself. And maybe, deep down, that's what everyone here was looking for. The next morning, when she brought him his meal, she found him kneeling by his bunk, eyes closed, hands clasped. He wasn't praying for release. He was praying for peace. "Lord," he murmured, "if I can't walk out of these walls, let me walk out clean." Ella stood quietly at the door, listening. Something inside her shifted. The job no longer felt like duty, it felt like calling. That evening, she saw him again in the chapel, alone, working on the last carving of the box. He looked up at her and smiled. "You ever think about what you'll leave behind, Ella?" She smiled faintly. "I haven't lived long enough to think about that." He chuckled softly. "Then start now. The world don't remember how you lived. It remembers what you leave." The chapel bell rang, echoing through the walls. As she turned to leave, she glanced back one last time. Amos was still carving, the light from the stained glass falling across his face, a mosaic of blue and gold. And for a moment, he didn't look like a prisoner. He looked like a man building his way back to heaven. Winter came early that year. The prison walls dripped with cold rain, and the air smelled of rust and wet concrete. Ella walked her rounds slower than usual, her mind heavy with what Amos had told her. Every word, every regret, lingered. That morning, she found him sitting in the chapel, the wooden box wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth. "I'm ready to make my request," he said. "For what?" she asked, though she already knew. "I want to bury it," he said, "right here in this ground. A promise should rest where the soul has peace. She smiled sadly. I'll talk to the warden. Later that afternoon, she stood in front of Warden Kent's desk, the rain beating the window behind him. He read the paper once, then looked up at her like she was a child who didn't understand how the world worked. A burial? Inside a state facility? He scoffed. We don't turn prisons into cemeteries, Miss Martinez. It's not a body, sir. Just a small box. It means a lot to him. Kent leaned back, rubbing his temples. He's served his time. He'll walk out in a week. Let him take it and bury it wherever he wants. Ella hesitated. He said, his time ends when this place ends. The warden's eyes hardened. Then his time ends here. The next day, Amos didn't speak. He didn't even look up when she passed. She could feel the weight of his silence pressing against her chest. When she finally asked him what was wrong, he just smiled faintly and said, Don't trouble yourself, child. The Lord knows when to open doors. Sometimes he just waits until we stop knocking. But that night, he collapsed in the workshop. They found him on the floor, still holding the box against his chest. The prison doctor said it was his heart, too weak, too tired. He'd need rest and medication, maybe transferred to the infirmary. Ella stayed by his bed as the others went back to their duties. His breath was shallow, his voice barely a whisper. Don't let the rules steal what's right, he said. This box, it's not for me. It's for the ones I hurt. Her throat tightened. I'll find a way. He gave a faint smile. You've got mercy in your eyes. Don't ever lose that. She didn't sleep that night. The sound of the rain never stopped, and neither did her thoughts. She went through the file room, searching through old maps of Northfield. That's when she saw it. A line on the blueprint marking the edge of the property. The chapel grounds were technically inside the facility's fence, but listed as religious annex. It hit her all at once. He could bury it, legally. The next morning, she walked straight to Warden Kent's office, holding the blueprints in trembling hands. If the chapel is part of the annex, then it's still within state property, she said quickly. Meaning the burial doesn't violate Regulation 14C. He looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. You've been digging through archives? Yes, sir, she said, her voice steady. Because mercy shouldn't need permission. For a moment, he said nothing. The rain outside softened. Then finally, he picked up his pen and signed the paper. Do it quietly, he said, before the inspectors come next week. When Ella handed Amos the signed approval, his eyes filled with tears. He pressed the paper to his heart. I told you, he said softly. The Lord opens doors. But he needs someone brave enough to turn the handle. That evening, as the storm passed and sunlight broke through the clouds, the chapel bell rang. It was the first clear day Northfield had seen in months. And for the first time, Amos Carter looked out through the iron bars and whispered, maybe heaven isn't far after all. The morning the order was approved, the whole prison seemed quieter, as if the walls themselves were listening. Ella walked down the corridor with the signed paper folded neatly in her pocket. When she reached the infirmary, Amos was sitting up in bed, sunlight spilling across his face. His skin looked thin, his hair white as frost, but his eyes, they were clear, steady, and peaceful. It's done, she said softly. You have permission. He looked at her for a long time before answering. You mean I can finally let it rest? She nodded. Tomorrow morning before sunrise, no one will know. He smiled, slow and grateful. Then I reckon the Lord ain't forgotten me yet. That night, Ella couldn't sleep. She thought about her own father, a man she hadn't spoken to in years after he left the family. She'd carried that anger like a stone in her chest, always telling herself she was nothing like him. But watching Amos, she realized forgiveness wasn't about letting someone else go. It was about freeing yourself from what you carry. At 5 a.m., the prison was still half asleep. The guards on the night shift were finishing coffee, the air heavy with the smell of rain-soaked dirt. Ella met Amos in the chapel courtyard. He walked slowly, one hand on his cane, the other clutching the wooden box. His breath came short, but his eyes were calm. "This is where it all began," he said quietly, "and where it should end." They dug a small patch of earth behind the chapel, right under the old oak tree that had stood there longer than anyone remembered. Ella helped him lower the box into the ground. His fingers trembled as he brushed the soil over it. "Do you want to say something?" she asked. He looked up at the pale morning sky. "Just this," he said. "If my daughter ever finds her way here, tell her her daddy didn't die in chains. He found peace before he met the Lord." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Amos whispered, almost to himself, "Freedom begins when you forgive yourself." When he turned to leave, he stumbled slightly. Ella caught his arm. "You should rest," she said. He smiled faintly. "Rest is coming soon enough, child." As she watched him walk back toward the cell block, the first light of dawn spread across the courtyard. The old oak cast a long shadow over the ground where the box now rested, quiet, unseen, but full of meaning. That night, the news came down. Northfield Prison was closing permanently. The land was to be sold, the inmates transferred. The place where Amos had spent 30 years of his life would soon be nothing but rubble. When Ella went to tell him, his bed was empty. The nurse said he'd passed peacefully in his sleep, sometime before dawn, just hours after burying the box. She stood there for a long time, staring at the folded blanket, the untouched tray of breakfast, the faint scent of cedar that still lingered. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "He kept his promise." At the far end of the infirmary, sunlight streamed through a barred window. Dust danced in the air like tiny souls. And for the first time since she'd started working there, Ella cried. Not for the prisoner who died behind walls, but for the man who had finally found his way out. 2 weeks later, Northfield Prison shut its gates for the last time. The iron doors slammed with a sound that echoed across the yard, not of punishment, but of endings. The guards packed up their lockers. The walls, once filled with noise, now hummed with silence. Ella stood near the chapel, watching the workers remove the cross from the rooftop. The oak tree still stood tall, branches heavy with new leaves. Under it, she knew, was the little box, Amos's promise to the world. She felt an ache rise in her chest. In a place built to break people, one man had taught her the opposite: how to rebuild. The following week, she attended the small memorial service held for Amos Carter. There were no family members, no friends, just 3 staff members and the chaplain. When the priest asked if anyone wished to speak, Ella stepped forward. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. "Mr. Carter wasn't perfect," she said. "None of us are. But he spent 30 years trying to make peace with the man he used to be. He reminded me that freedom isn't a place outside these walls. It's something you find when you stop running from your own reflection." The chaplain nodded gently. "Amen." After the service, Ella stayed behind. She placed a folded note on the wooden pew. It read, "You were right. The world remembers what you leave behind." Months passed. The land where the prison once stood was cleared and sold. Ella transferred to a community rehabilitation center in Houston, a smaller place, quieter, focused on helping former inmates start over. But Amos never left her mind. Every time she saw a man sit silently in the corner, afraid to hope, she thought of him. Every time someone said, "I don't deserve a second chance," she heard Amos's voice again. Freedom begins when you forgive yourself. One evening, after her shift ended, she stopped by a construction site where a new community building was going up. The sign out front read, "Second Chance Initiative, a program for rehabilitation and hope." She stood there for a long while, watching the sunset glow across the half-built walls. The name wasn't chosen by chance. It was hers. She had started it with a small grant and a bigger dream, to create a place for those who wanted to start over like Amos did. Inside the building, a simple plaque hung by the entrance, in memory of Amos Carter. He taught us that forgiveness is the longest road, but the only one worth walking. That night, as she locked up and stepped outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and soil, the same scent that filled the air the morning Amos buried his box. She looked up at the sky and smiled. "Rest easy now, Mr. Carter," she whispered. "Your promise lives on." And as the wind rustled the nearby trees, for just a moment, she thought she heard his voice. Soft, warm, certain. "You turn the handle, Ella." The lights of the new center flickered on, one by one, casting a golden glow over the street. And somewhere deep in the earth, under the roots of a forgotten oak tree, the box lay still, sealed with faith and forgiveness. Because in the end, he was right. Freedom doesn't begin when the doors open. It begins when the heart finally does. 10 years later, the land where Northfield Prison once stood had turned into something unrecognizable. A public park stretched across the hills, green, quiet, filled with children's laughter. The air no longer smelled of rust and sweat, but of grass and sunlight. Where the chapel once stood, there was now a plaque half hidden by vines. Site of Northfield Correctional Facility, 1932-2015. That morning, a small crew arrived with shovels and cameras. It was part of a local project to uncover time capsules rumored to have been buried when the old buildings were torn down. No one expected to find much. Maybe a few letters, a coin, or a rusted tool. But when one of the men struck metal, they all stopped. He dug carefully until a small wooden box appeared, edges worn but perfectly sealed. Someone laughed. "Guess this is our treasure." The foreman brushed away the dirt, reading the faint carving on top. "For when the walls forget." Inside there was no gold, no photos, no trinkets. Just a single folded paper, yellowed by time. The words written inside, shaky but clear. "Freedom begins when you forgive yourself." Amos Carter. The crew stood in silence. One of them whispered, "Wasn't that the name of a prisoner? The one from the old stories?" The discovery made the local paper that week, a small column buried near the back pages. Most people skipped over it, but one woman didn't. Ella Martinez sat in her office at the Second Chance Initiative, the afternoon sun casting warm light across her desk. When she saw the name, she froze. Her eyes blurred for a moment before she smiled. She folded the newspaper and walked into the community hall, where a group of men and women were gathered, people fresh out of prison, learning to rebuild their lives. She stood before them, holding the article. 10 years ago, she said, a man I once knew buried a box in the ground. Inside it, he left just a few words words he believed could outlive him. He didn't know those words would change my life, and maybe, one day, yours too. She paused, her voice soft but steady. He said, "Freedom begins when you forgive yourself." And I've learned that's true, because forgiveness is the bridge between who you were and who you can still become. The room was quiet, every eye on her. Then one man in the back whispered, "What happened to him?" Ella smiled gently. He made it home. Later that evening, she walked out to the small garden behind the center. There was a new oak tree there now, planted from a seed she had taken from Northfield before it was torn down. Underneath it, a new time capsule rested, sealed with her own letter. She placed her hand on the soil and whispered, "If someone finds this one day, I hope they understand. Redemption is never lost. It just waits for the right hands to uncover it." The wind moved softly through the leaves, like an old voice carried across time. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ella looked up at the sky and smiled. She didn't need to wonder anymore if she'd made a difference. Because somewhere, in the quiet rhythm of forgiveness and second chances, Amos Carter was still alive, not in body, but in every person who walked through those doors believing they could begin again. Freedom begins when you forgive yourself. And sometimes, that's all the world needs to hear.